Welcome back. Missing and Murdered is an award-winning podcast that over 2 seasons hooked listeners with its examination into the two cold Canadian cases of Alberta Williams and Cleo Samaganus.
But beneath the mystery, host Connie Walker also examines Indigenous history and systematic racism, all through the gripping true crime lens. Connie Walker joins us now. Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
Connie, you've talked before about how your podcast uses sort of true crime storytelling techniques as a way to engage people into learning about Canadian history, essentially. Can you explain how?
There's an insatiable appetite right now for true crime, anything, but podcasts in particular. And I think what we've been trying to do with the podcasts that we work on is kind of use that popularity, use this kind of excitement and interest in the mystery of these unsolved cases to help tell a bigger story. I mean, at the root of our podcast and really every single case of a missing or murdered Indigenous woman and girl is an unsolved mystery, an unsolved case, and a family behind it that is desperate for answers and seeking justice.
Connie, did the success of the podcast, and it was like massively successful, did it ever suggest to you that we have been drastically failing in sort of humanizing the stories of these missing women in any way?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, my interest from this comes from I'm an Indigenous woman. I'm Cree from Saskatchewan. I grew up on my reserve. I remember my interest comes from when I was in high school and a young Indigenous woman from a reserve not far from where I was growing up was killed. And her name was Pamela George. And I remember that the two men who were on trial in her death were white university students. I remember news reports, calling them, one was a basketball star, the other was a hockey standout.
Mm.
And the thing that they said about Pamela was that she was an Aboriginal prostitute. And that kind of coverage and that kind of, media attention on the victim of a terrible crime was absolutely dehumanizing. And that's one example of several examples, going back decades in Canadian history and Canadian media.
True crime has become a popular cultural genre, which in and of itself might be a controversial way of describing true crime because with shows and movies, it is a form of entertainment, and yet you're talking about real lives lost, real mysteries, real pain. So, can you talk about how you navigate the quote unquote sensational entertainment elements of storytelling, like a cliffhanger, hanger, for example,
Mm-hmm.
versus managing the sympathy and the empathy that is the purpose of storytelling?
Yeah, I mean, the truth is that I think every true crime story, I think it's really important to never lose sight that there are real people at the heart of it, real people who've experienced a terrible trauma and a terrible loss, and are often, even if it's decades later, still grappling with that and still dealing with that. And that it's more than an exploration of the violence that resulted in their
Mm-hmm.
death or disappearance, that this is an opportunity to show the impacts of that violence and also where it comes from. Alberta died in 1989 and her case has been unsolved, but really the story of her murder began a lot longer before that. It began, even before her birth. It began with the legacy of residential schools in Canada and the intergenerational trauma that still is so many communities and families are grappling with. And it also, is a story about policing in Canada and policing in
Mm-hmm.
Indigenous communities.
I want to stay with the ethical considerations, especially in relationship to Indigenous communities. Can you talk about why it's important to be in the storytelling aware of the effect that trauma has and the role that it
Mhm.
plays in the story?
I remember when I started reporting on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, meeting families and sitting down to talk to them about their loved one who was missing or who had been killed. And inevitably, like, that was never the only trauma that they experienced, that there was
Right.
always another loss in the family, or there was some other kind of violence. And and through this work, it's just helped me realize and identify just how common it is. And I think that, like, learning about approaches to trauma and understanding that that people can experience trauma, and that doesn't mean that everybody ends up being traumatized. And for so many people, there is no other choice but to kind of keep going
Mhm.
through all of this. And so, I think that for me, that's like an evolving conversation around understanding the impacts, because I've also seen like journalism and storytelling and the way that we can amplify people's stories, empower people in a way.
Well, your new podcast with Gimlet Media focuses on the story of a missing persons case from the American Indigenous community. So, what did you learn about the issues with missing women and girls in the U.S.?
The history, although there are so many similarities in terms of colonization and the impacts of colonization and the impacts of institutional racism, and we had residential schools and they had boarding schools. We have broken treaty promises. They have broken treaty promises. We have dispossession of, like, there are so many similarities, but as within Canada as well, in terms of like the diversity of nations in the United States, it's incredibly diverse, and there are so many differences. And so I very much am like recognizing that the communities that I'm visiting and the people that I am meeting, I'm a stranger, that I am not from there. I am learning in a way. I feel like I'm informed by my experiences, and there are a lot of similarities, but I'm approaching it as carefully as I can possibly be, and trying to be aware of everything I don't know. The biggest kind of takeaway for me is that like the impacts of the violence are staggering. Just the rates of violence, like 1 in 2 Indigenous women in the United States will be a victim of some kind of sexual assault in their lifetime. Some Indigenous communities in the United States have 10 times the murder rates than the rest of the population. I think those are similar statistics in Canada that Indigenous women and girls face. I think that what has happened in Canada is that we've really been pushing those conversations into the forefront in the last few years. Like, I've been able to do 2 seasons of a podcast about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls here. And I think those conversations are starting to happen. There's starting to be a recognition of the importance of better representing Indigenous communities and stories from those communities in the U.S., but it's just starting.
You're a podcaster now, which is a relatively modern profession and career, but before it was a more traditional job. You were a news reporter for 2 decades, actually. So can you tell us what it was like pitching Indigenous stories at that point in your career?
Oh, I mean, I started as an intern in 2000. For CBC Morning, which is a national morning show. You guys probably don't remember, but but I was an intern,
I
and
do.
it was the summer that there was a fisheries dispute on the East Coast between Indigenous fishermen and non-Indigenous fishermen, and the tensions erupted in the same way that we have just seen play out again and again, and history just keeps kind of repeating itself. But I remember being an intern at the time and booking a local chief to come on the program to talk about the dispute, and I booked him to come on a Monday morning. So I was booking him on Friday. And I remember the senior producer on the show at the time saying to me, okay, so you told him what time and he knows where to go. And I was like, yes, yes, yes. And she said, because those Indians, they'll go out drinking all weekend and they won't show up on a Monday morning. And I remember like just freezing in the moment, like just feeling frozen, but looking around and being like, did anyone, we're in this busy newsroom, did anybody else hear that? And everybody else is just worried about their own thing on Friday afternoon. No one else listened. And and I think about that because I didn't say anything at the time. I didn't feel like I could say anything. But it really set the tone for telling me, who was comfortable in this space and who's not comfortable in this space, and what stories are okay and which ones are not okay.
Thank you so much for being here with us and joining us to talk about this. You can catch more from Connie in conversation with our friend Tanya Talega at the Hot Docs Podcast Festival, which is on demand until the end of February. We're going to take a break and we'll be right back.